Okay, great. Welcome back. Call the Spiny Dogfish board meeting to order. Apologies to those online that we ran a little late at lunch, but we're got some vitamin D coursing through our bodies now, ready to get back into business. Looking at our agenda, I think we'll be able to make up the time, perhaps not as quick as Erica Burgess got through the Coastal Sharks meeting yesterday, but we'll do our best to not delay striped bass. So looking at the agenda, are there any, is there any opposition to approving the agenda as is? Seeing none, we'll consider that the agenda approved and move on to the proceedings from our last meeting in August of 2023. Are there any clarifications, edits, corrections to those proceedings? Seeing none, we will consider them approved by consent. We're going to move on to item 3, public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda. Not seeing any hands in the audience. Anything online, James? None online, so we can move on to item 4, which is to review the Atlantic Sturgeon Fishery Management Action Team Plan Development Team alternatives. We have Carson Cisneros from the Mid-Atlantic Council here to give us a presentation. The commission is closely tracking this joint council action, as there's an expectation that the Dogfish Board will be taking some complementary action once that action gets a little bit further along. So without further ado, go to Carson for her presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you, Madam Chair, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'll just give it a minute to see if the slides pop up. But as noted, I'm going to give an overview of the Mid-Atlantic Council and New England Council's joint framework action to reduce sturgeon bycatch in the dogfish and monkfish fisheries. I'll basically be giving you all an update of the progress that's been made thus far. There hasn't been any final action or anything. So in terms of background on why this action was initiated, so in 2021, there was a biological opinion issued by NOAA Fisheries as required by the Endangered Species Act, and this addressed several different FMPs. But one of the outcomes from that biological opinion, or BIOP, was that Atlantic sturgeon bycatch must be reduced in federal large mesh gillnet fisheries by 2024. And so to address the BIOP, NMFS formed the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group, and that group produced an action plan that recommended the council process should be used to meet the needed reductions. And dogfish and monkfish were both identified as high contributors to the sturgeon bycatch, and they're both jointly managed by the New England and Mid-Atlantic councils. And then some of the potential measures to reduce sturgeon bycatch that were recommended within that action plan were modifications to gear. Low-profile gill nets have been tested in the monkfish fishery in New Jersey and have been shown to reduce sturgeon bycatch. And then reductions in soak time, and as well as focused time area measures, including closures in hotspot bycatch areas. Next slide, please. So in response to this action plan conclusion, the councils each initiated a joint framework action earlier this year. And so in June, the councils did find out that the incidental take statement, or ITS, was exceeded in gillnet fisheries. So there was an overage of sturgeon bycatch, and a new biological opinion has been reinitiated just last month. So this is kind of an evolving situation, but the previous 2021 BIOP is still active and requires that bycatch reduction by 2024. But because of the timing, the new BIOP will likely use the current framework action as a baseline instead of the current status quo conditions. And so currently staff are working with GARFO through the FMAT PDT that was formed for this action in order to share data and make sure that these processes are informing each other and we're addressing the issue as needed. Next slide. So this is just a quick overview of where the hotspot areas are for Atlantic sturgeon bycatch and gillnet fisheries. These were identified in the action plan and are based on observer data. And so the map on the left shows the Gulf of Maine and southern New England. And then on the right, the map shows New Jersey down through Virginia and northern North Carolina. And so the more pink and red areas have the densest sturgeon and gillnet interactions. So as you can see, there are some interactions in the Gulf of Maine and southern New England, but the highest density hotspots are really off of New Jersey and the Delmarva Peninsula on the right. And in general, there are seasonal trends within these hotspots where there's a peak in interactions in the spring closer inshore, and then a peak in the winter a little bit further offshore. Next slide. So I mentioned the FMAT PDT earlier, and I just wanted to introduce the group a little bit. So this is kind of a merging of the New England process of PDTs and the Mid-Atlantic process of fishery management action teams. And on this team, we have monkfish and dogfish and sturgeon expertise. We have representation from GARFO, including people from Sustainable Fisheries, Protected Resources, and NEPA. And then we have Science Center expertise with the observer data and sturgeon population dynamics. And then we have ASMFC staff, James Boyle represented on the team as well. Next slide, please. So this is the action timeline, and today's meeting is highlighted in green. So at this point, there have been several meetings, and these have been to really facilitate the early development of the range of alternatives. And the FMAT and PDT formed and met in April. And then in May, the dogfish and monkfish APs and committees met. And then in June, the councils met. And so during that first set of meetings, there were preliminary alternatives developed. And then the councils decided in June that the committee needed to meet again to further refine the range of alternatives with more input from enforcement. And so because of this, in September, the FMAT and PDT and committee met again to narrow the range of alternatives and refine them in order to keep with the action timeline and have a reasonable range of alternatives. And so the New England Council approved a range of alternatives at their late September meeting, and then the Mid-Atlantic Council approved that same range at their meeting in early October, so just 2 weeks ago. And then since then, staff and the FMAT and PDT are starting to analyze those alternatives and impacts and starting development of that final framework document. And so in late winter, so now we're on the other side of the green highlighted line of today's meeting. In late winter, likely February, there'll be another set of advisory panel for dogfish and monkfish and committee meetings to review the analysis and recommend those preferred alternatives. And then final action is scheduled for April of next year for both councils. And the requirement was to reduce sturgeon bycatch by 2024. So we anticipate rulemaking late in the year and implementation. Next slide, please. So now I'll get into some of the types of measures that were developed for the action. And these were developed by the FMAT and PDT or by the Dogfish and Monkfish Committee. The first one is gillnet soak time limits. And these would be in place within the hotspot areas during specific times of year where interactions are occurring. And different soak time options were considered, including no overnight soaks and maximums of 24, 48, and 72-hour soak times. All of these iterations were originally considered, but there were concerns with soak times of 24 hours or greater because those restrictions may not necessarily reduce the overall nets in the water if a fisherman hauls back their net and then immediately resets it. And it was discussed that the action requires that sturgeon bycatch overall needs to be reduced, so not just bycatch mortality, because the shorter soak times can reduce bycatch mortality. And then in addition to that concern, the 24-hour soak times or greater did raise a lot of concerns from enforcement representatives. And so Ultimately, the only soak time restriction option that was kept in this action was no overnight soaks, since that would reduce nets in the water and was deemed more enforceable, preferably with a discrete ending time instead of something like sunset. So a discrete ending time of 8 p.m. was proposed, and daytime hours can vary seasonally. And so this was only kept in the dogfish range of alternatives because the monkfish fishery requires multi-day soaks in order to operate. And then these soak times, daytime only soak times, were discussed in general as more feasible in the New Jersey hotspot area, whereas in the southern mid-Atlantic areas, fishermen have said that they need to keep the nets in overnight, so they may need to consider other measures. Next slide, please. So another option for reducing sturgeon bycatch in hotspot areas is the use of low-profile gillnet gear, which was described in the action plan. So this would also be for specific times of year when bycatch is high, and in those hotspot areas. And this option has only really been researched in the monkfish fishery and in the New Jersey region, where it has been shown to reduce sturgeon bycatch while still maintaining monkfish catch. And so this type of net hasn't been tested for spiny dogfish or monkfish in the New England areas. So because of this, this was only included as an option for monkfish. Next slide, please. Lastly, small time area closures are another option included in the range of alternatives to reduce bycatch. And these are included for both dogfish and monkfish. And there were 3 different methods considered to capture those hotspot areas. So these methods include drawing small polygons around the bycatch hotspots, using parallel lines to shore. Another approach was using 10-minute squares to cover a hotspot area. And then a third approach was including the entire statistical area that contains the hotspot. And so there were pros and cons to each approach, but ultimately the first option, using parallel lines to draw the areas, had the most flexibility and was deemed more enforceable than the 10-minute square approach, which could create an area with more than 4 sides. And then using entire statistical areas would include a large amount of area that was not considered a hotspot area. So that was considered too much of a burden on the fisheries, potentially without reducing more sturgeon bycatch. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all of these one by one, but this slide shows the final range of monkfish alternatives that were approved by both councils. So these alternatives include a low profile net requirements or closures in the New Jersey hotspot area, and a closure option in the southern New England hotspot area. And then the southern New England closure has options in May and June, while the New Jersey timing of restriction or closure is December and May. Next slide. So this is the range of dogfish alternatives that were approved by both councils. So the types of restriction for dogfish are either no overnight soaks or time area closures. And there are options for these restrictions to be applied to hotspot areas in New Jersey, as well as hotspots off the coast of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. And the timing of closures or restrictions for New Jersey is November, December, and or April. And for the southern mid-Atlantic, the timing options are December, January, and or March. Next slide, please. So some other considerations that have come up throughout the development of this action are kind of listed on this slide. So the committee discussed the potential requirement of VMS in these fisheries in order to increase enforceability of the different options, and potentially for some benefits of refining the hotspot areas in the future or collecting further data. Enforcement representatives did clarify that they would still be able to enforce the alternatives that were included in the final range without a VMS requirement. And the councils ultimately felt it would be too large of a burden to the fisheries, so they didn't include a VMS requirement within the range of alternatives for either fishery. Another consideration is that the sturgeon bycatch data need to be updated for the hotspot analysis. So once that's done, the hotspot area boundaries can be drawn more firmly. And so we're also planning to provide a state versus federal waters breakdown of the bycatch for these fisheries, because that's been requested by the councils. And then lastly, both councils recommended future research on the use of data loggers as a tool to enforce gillnet soak times, as well as the exploration of low-profile gillnet gear in the spiny dogfish fishery and other regions beyond New Jersey for monkfish. So further work in these areas can help enable the councils to have more management tools in the future if more sturgeon bycatch needs to be mitigated. Next slide, please. So lastly, these are the next steps that I already touched on during the timeline slide. So the council staff, New England and Mid-Atlantic council staff are both working with the FMAT and PDT to analyze the data and alternatives and develop the framework document. So we've just gotten started on that. And around February, the Dogfish and Monkfish APs will meet, followed by the Joint Dogfish and Monkfish Committee in order to recommend those preferred alternatives to the council. And then both councils will take final action at their April meetings. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Carson, for that overview. A lot of great information there for the board. Are there any questions from the board for Carson about her presentation? I think you covered it excellently, Carson. There's no questions right now from the board. I think the one thing that James and I wanted to discuss with the board, though, is next steps for us on the matter. Oh, there's a question, David Borton.
Question, Nicola. Could we go back to, I think it's slide 3, where you put up the number of interaction? Yeah, that, and the, excuse me. I'm a little bit concerned about the ITS being based on 2011 and 2015 observer data. And just for everyone's edification, I have nothing to do with the gillnet fishery. Excuse me. But I have listened to a lot of monk skate discussions on this issue, and it's quite apparent that the gillnet fishery over the past 10 years is totally contracting in terms of the amount of gear that is used, number of gillnets set, where they're set, and so forth. So if you use a time period going back to 2011 to 15, I'm afraid it may bias the result. Yeah, I think it would be better to try to integrate some of the more recent effort data and fishery location information in the future. Thank you.
Carson, do you have any response to that about the years being incorporated in the new biological opinion or otherwise?
Yes. Yes, I'm not sure of the exact years that the new biop that was just reinitiated will use, but for our action, we will use through 2022. So all of the bycatch and sturgeon interactions that of recent years will be used to draw the sort of boundaries and look at the trends. So the ITS, the incidental take statement that was developed is kind of a limit that shouldn't be exceeded. And that was derived from 2011 to 2015. And then a look at recent years, so 2016 to 2021 is where there was quite a bit of an increase in sturgeon takes in the gillnet fishery in recent years. So that's kind of what has triggered this new biological opinion and definitely kind of further emphasized the need for action. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Carson. Any other questions now that you've had a moment to let it marinate? Okay, seeing none, the as I was saying, just James and I wanted to bring up the potential for the board's next action. It seems it's early at this point. There's a lot more detail that's going to be developed for the options within the range of alternatives. So we think that we'll either be looking at the February or May meeting would be the time that the board has some more information and may start to think about initiating some type of complementary action for in-state waters for dogfish. And as Carson said, we may have some more specific information about the bycatch proportion between state and federal waters that could inform what this board wants to do. So that concludes this topic, and we can move on to the FMP review and state compliance reports, and we'll turn to James for that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just wait for 1 second for the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I think I can go over this pretty quickly so we can stay relatively on schedule. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just jump right in. So here's just a very quick overview of the presentation. I'll start with a reminder of the status of the stock, which is still based on the 2018 stock assessment update. And then I'll discuss the fishery in 2022-2023 and wrap up with the state compliance, de minimis requests, and PRT recommendations. So the latest stock status information for management use still comes from the 2018 stock assessment update. Female spawning stock biomass was estimated to be 106,753 metric tons in 2018, which was above the threshold of 79,644 metric tons. In 2017, fishing mortality on exploitable females was estimated to be 0.202 and has remained below the threshold level of 0.244 since 2005. A management track assessment was recently peer reviewed and will be reviewed by the Mid-Atlantic Council's Science and Statistical Committee on October 30th and is scheduled to be presented to the Mid-Atlantic and New England Councils in December and January, respectively. In terms of the commercial quota and landings, the fishing year ran from May 1st, 2022 to April 30th, 2023. The quota was 29.56 million pounds, and the trip limit was 7,500 pounds for the northern region states. And commercial landings in total were approximately 12.6 million pounds, which is about a 28% increase from fishing year 2021 to 2022. Recreational harvest was approximately 211,608 pounds in the fishing year 2022, which is about a 41% decrease from the previous fishing year. The dead discards were estimated to be about 2.5 million pounds, which is an 8% increase from 2021-2022 fishing season. All regions and states harvested within their quota, and all states implemented regulations consistent with the requirements of the FMP. Under the Spiny Dogfish FMP, a state may be granted de minimis status upon request if its landings are less than 1% of the coastwide landings. Both New York and Delaware requested and qualify for de minimis status. There are just a few PRT recommendations and comments. So first thing, Connecticut did not meet the compliance report deadline. Additionally, while every state satisfied the weekly reporting requirement through either SAFIS or NOAA fisheries, a couple of states still did not provide the reporting regulations that show the requirement, and the PRT requests those going forward just for clarity. New York noted in their report that their finning regulations only apply to coastal sharks, but they are working to amend those to include spiny dogfish going forward. Furthermore, the PRT maintained the note that the FMP gives a fairly broad definition of biomedical supply for exempted fishing permits, and that states are reporting harvest under a variety of research and education purposes. So while the reported harvest under these permits are well below the 1,000 fish limit, the PRT may require board input on what types of harvests can count towards this limit in the future should any state start to near that 1,000 fish limit. And finally, the PRT continues to recommend the board consider the purpose of the current de minimis provisions, given that all states must satisfy the only monitoring requirement, which is to report annual landings regardless of de minimis status. And with that, the board action to consider today is the approval of the FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2022-2023 fishing year, as well as the de minimis requests from New York and Delaware. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. Are there any questions from the board about the FMP review? Seeing none, is there anyone that would like to make a motion? Ray Kane? Could you read it into the record, please, Ray?
Yeah, move to approve the fishery management plan, review state compliance reports, and de minimis request for Delaware, New York for the 2022-2023 fishing year.
Motion by Ray Kane, is there a second? John Clark, thank you. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, we'll consider that approved. Is there any further business to come before the board today? Seeing none, we'll consider this adjourned, and I'll look to Tony for any announcement about the next board meeting start